Are you a gamer? No, that's probably for the best. Video games can change people, it can suck away their lives, and in this case specifically, it's quite literal. Video game isekais are like isekais, but video game. I can explain that better. They're like isekais, but instead of being thrown into a random fantasy world or having the random fantasy world find you, the fantasy world is instead a video game world. There are plenty of series that have our main character enter the VR gaming world, like The Strongest Florist, World's Strongest Troll, or +9 Reinforced Wooden Stick. These are fantastically fun series that are not the focus of this week's video. No, not video game series, but video game isekai series. That isekai part is important, where the game becomes reality. Now, from my long list of Webtoon series, not a flex, more embarrassing than anything, these kinds of series are a little more tricky to find. Not isekais with video game-like systems and skills, those are a dime a dozen, and they're a great dime a dozen, but actual video game isekais are a little trickier to find. The only one I could actually remember for a long time was I'm the Max Level Newbie, having the VR game The Tower of Trials, or The Trial of Towers, I forgot to look which one it was, crash into the world, which is actually a very fun series, but if you wanted your fill, that's kind of all you got. Until recently, because Surviving the Game as a Barbarian dropped earlier this month, and man, oh man, if you're into any video game, isekai, fantasy thing at all, you need to check it out. Surviving the Game as a Barbarian, other than being a mouthful to say, is about a gamer. Okay, I'll stop. The series is about our main character, Hansu Lee. We start the series in a hospital, for reasons that are not yet explained to us. Maybe later in the series. Something to look forward to, I guess. Speaking of looking forward to things, Hansu Lee isn't... Yeah, he's a gamer, sure, but he's played everything. AOS's, RPGs, FPS's, anything and every game under the sun. He's tried and been disappointed. No game had that spark, nothing that grabbed his attention, causing him to quit most games very quickly. That is, until he found a new game, a small indie game, an RPG with 2D retro pixels, a game called Dungeon and Stone. And if you played any indie game, you know these are the great picks. Hansu Lee doesn't expect to get into it. He chooses the Barbarian, expecting to stop after some time. I mean, technically he does stop after 9 years. Yeah, he gets real into it, playing through his entire hospital stay, his social agent service, his college, even through his job. He spends his entire 20s getting through this one game. Man, he must suck at games. Turns out, no. This game is hard. Like, hard. Like, not even Dark Souls can compare to this game. Not only was death around what seemed like every corner, but every death would reset his progress. Dungeon and Stone was a difficult game, to the point that it was so unpopular that there was no walkthroughs online for it. So he had to play the game entirely on his own in a language he didn't even speak. That's dedication. Anyways, after 9 years, he finally gets to the end of the game, as he's staring down the gates of the abyss. When entering it, it sucks him into the game as a barbarian. Yes, indeed, Hansu Lee ain't Hansu Lee anymore. He's reborn as Bjorn, son of Yandel. Reborn as a barbarian in the world of Dungeon and Stone, the indie game in case you forgot. Now, why am I so excited for this series? Other than the video game-like premise, it has very similar isekai premise to many other series. Our main character gets snagged from one world and thrown into another world and has influence from the previous world to help influence them and gain an advantage and all that fun stuff. The Greatest Estate developer has my favorite approach to this, having our main character Lloyd in a new fantasy world not be magically gifted or physically strong and skilled, but instead have architectural skills from his previous life and using a system to basically introduce everyone to basic modern architecture. But Surviving the Game as a Barbarian has this approach, but in a different way. Surprisingly, when you play a game for basically a decade of your life, you learn a lot about that. Hansu Lee learned so much about Dungeon and Stone. Spending your 20s playing one game does that to a person, I guess. Which leads to what makes this series actually really great. Hansu Lee as Bjorn, son of Yandel, I refuse to acknowledge him as anything else, is a barbarian, obviously. But barbarians are kind of tricky characters. If you've ever played like any D&D, you know barbarians ain't the brightest bulb. In this game, we see exactly that. These barbarians are wild, intense, and real dumb. Just a bunch of himbos. Hansu Lee as a barbarian has the body of a brute, but has the brains of the mastermind who's almost completed this entire game. He's seen traps, he's seen monsters, he's played as other races, he knows how the system works, he knows how this game works. So even as a dumb barbarian, he knows more than practically everyone else in this world. Which brings us to my two favorite things about this series. That said world and that said knowledge. The world of Dungeon and Stone, known as Rhadonia, is, yes, a video game obviously, but more importantly to me, just a fantasy world. You might think, obviously, that's kind of the point of an isekai, and you'd be right to think that, but you'd also be wrong. Mainly because of these. In so many isekais, reverse isekais, video games, whatever version you want, there is a system. The system is pretty much what it sounds like. It's pretty much a video game menu. Now, most isekais handle this system in pretty similar ways. Video game-like menus that have different uses depending on the series. Most have one main mechanic: to give profiles about the main character. These profiles are usually like their stats, if they have any classes, if they have any skills or any items or any of that stuff. It's often pretty specific to the individual. Another common but not widespread use is any quest that the system or the world assigns. That's pretty much the limit of most systems in series though. I like systems enough, but they can kind of feel just like a bit basic. I feel like they're weirdly dependent on systems, but also they don't utilize them to their fullest. To me, it should be all or nothing. As an example, I would use the Greatest Estate Developer, but I already did that. So I was the final boss. A great reverse isekai that follows the tower boss that became human. We can skip some of this stuff. Okay, here. But we see that his system works entirely differently, being a dark red instead of blue like other humans, but also seemingly has a personality. The system talks to Baphomet, interacts with him. Meanwhile, on the opposite end, we have the Academy's undercover professor. It is an isekai, yes, but it has no system at all, to the point where it just feels like a normal fantasy series. Watch last week's video for that. Anyways, back to surviving the game as a barbarian. There is technically a system, but it's very rarely used. More just a narration thing. We see that Hansu Lee as the barbarian yells a bunch of things to try to pull up a menu, but nothing appears. Not to mention that this world is brutal. It is a hard fantasy. There are a lot of things I could show, but I'm not sure YouTube would love watching our main character step on a poisonous bear trap and then proceed to crawl through the dungeon for miles while bleeding out. So let's look at health potions. I always wondered what health potions taste like. I assumed they're like cough syrup or something like that, but we don't have to wonder here because they don't drink them, but also because it hurts more than being stabbed. Yeah, these potions don't just sting, they hurt. This small little detail shows how brutal and unforgiving this world is. And surprisingly, it doesn't stop at just the health potions. I mentioned Hansu Lee became a barbarian, obviously. But barbarians aren't a class, but an entire race. And there are in-world reasons and explanations about them, like how they're not allowed to work. The only way they can earn money is through fighting monsters in the dungeon. That priests are weirdly just legally not allowed to heal them. But also that a barbarian's heart can sell for a high price on the black market. And we see this when a human tries to betray our lovely, terrifying barbarian by pretending to be his night companion. Man, that does sound... It is a very weird thing to say. A companion to stand watch while they take turns sleeping, to make sure no goblin stabs them while they're asleep. But it turns out that the biggest threat wasn't the goblin, but the human with a warhammer. The world is dangerous. There is no time to rest in the dungeon. People will betray you for quick cash. There are traps and monsters around every corner. This world will kill you. It is dangerous, but also refreshingly fantasy. This world is terrifying. Who knows what's gonna happen? Who knows what's around any corner? Anything can and might happen, which makes this world refreshingly high stakes. And luckily, our main character, barbarian protagonist, has an advantage. Which brings us to my second favorite thing, the knowledge. Ah yes, I sound like a high school teacher. But no, mainly in our main character, Hansu Lee. It makes sense that he's so smart in this world. He's been playing this game for a decade. But watching him making different but really smart choices is really cool. The best example I can give you is right at the beginning. Like I said, barbarians weirdly can't have normal jobs. They're the only race that starts off by giving you a weapon. When you think of barbarians, you think of these massive hulking beasts with massive great swords or double-sided axes or war hammers or these massive dangerous murder weapons. But they're damage dealers. But have you ever stopped to think why? Hansel Lee tried every single weapon with a barbarian and would die very early every time. It wasn't until so many times he finally thought why. Why do barbarians have to be damage dealers? He grabs a shield and tries being a tanker, and it made his life infinitely easier. He would get farther faster just by choosing a shield. This little choice early on shows how much Hansel Lee thinks and how much he thinks differently. There's nothing I love more than a character who's just built differently. Someone who acts or thinks differently. Sure, I'm kind of more into the cunning and devious people, but I like someone who can make smart choices, but aren't arrogant. Hansel Lee recognizes his flaws, like when entering a dungeon, he has fear that basically cripples him. But I appreciate when a series shows our main character thinking differently, which shows that he can get farther than anyone else in this world. And it's been a blast. So please check out Surviving the Game as a Barbarian, updating every week on Webtoon.